What do you make of all the UFO sightings?
I am all in favor of an open, agnostic, transparent scientific investigation of UFOs and UAPs. But the idea that there's any data that we have that links UFOs and UAPs to non-human technology, I just think the standards, none of what is claimed to be the data lives up to the standards of evidence. So let's just take a moment on that idea of standards of evidence, because I've made a big deal about this both, in the book and elsewhere whenever I talk about this. So what people have to understand about science is scientists, we are really mean to each other. We are brutal to each other because we have this thing that we call standards of evidence. And it's the idea of like, you have a piece of evidence that you want to link to a claim. And, under what conditions can you say, oh, look, I've got evidence of, this claim X, Y, and Z. And in science, we are so mean to each other about whether or not that piece of evidence lives up to the standards that we have. And we spent 400 years determining what those standards are. And that is why cell phones work, right? If you didn't have super rigorous standards about, what you think this little antenna, I've invented a new kind of antenna that I can slip into the cell phone and I can show you that it works. If you didn't have these standards, every cell phone would be a brick, right? And when it comes to UFOs and UAPs, the evidence you have and the claim that, this shows that, we are being visited by non-human advanced civilization just doesn't even come close to the same standards I'm going to have to obey or whatever, live under. If my team, the group I work with, if one of them says, look, wants to announce that, we've discovered techno signature on an alien planet, we're going to get shredded, as we expect to be. We expect to be beaten up. And, the UAP, UFO community should expect the same thing. You don't get a pass because it's a really cool topic. So that's where I am right now. I just don't think any of the evidence is even close to anything that could support that claim.
Well, I generally assign a lot of value to anecdotal evidence from pilots. Not scientific value, but just like, it's always nice to get anecdotal evidence as a first step. So I was like, I wonder if there's something there. But unfortunately, with this topic, there's so much excitement around it. There's a lot of people that are basically trying to make money off of it. There's hoaxes, all this kind of stuff. So
right.
Even if there's some signal, there's just so much noise. It's very difficult to operate with. So how do we get better signal? So you've talked about sort of, if we wanted to really search for UFOs on Earth.
Right.
And maybe detect things like weird physics. What kind of instruments would we be using?
Yeah, so in the book I talked about the idea. This is really stupid, but you want to look up, you want to look down, and you want to look all around.
I think that's brilliant. I mean, it's simple, not stupid. It's like literally.
Yeah, right. So you want to do ground-based detectors, that upward-looking ground-based detectors of the kind we're already building for meteors, right? For tracking meteors. You want to have space-based detectors, put them on satellites. This is what the NASA UAP panel was thinking about, and then probably on we have lots of people in the sky. There should be detectors on the planes, or at least, some kind of alert system that if a pilot says, oh, look, I'm seeing something I don't understand, boop, presses the red button, and that triggers the ground-based and space-based data collectors. And then the data collectors themselves, this is something that people really don't understand, and it's so important. In order to actually do science with anything, the data you have to understand where it came from, like down to the nth degree. You have to know how that camera behaves in a bunch of different wavelengths. You have to characterize that. You have to know what the software does, what the limits of the software are possible. You have to know what happened to the camera. Was it refurbished recently? In every spectral wavelength, in all of its data collection and processing, you have to know all of those steps and have them all characterized. Because especially if you want to claim like, oh my God, I saw something take a right-hand turn at Mach 500, right? You better have all of that nailed down before you make that kind of claim. So we have to have characterized detectors looking up, down, and maybe on planes themselves. We need a rational search strategy. So let's say you want to lay out these ground-based detectors. Where do you put them? right? There's only so much money in the world. So, do you want to put them near places where you've seen a lot of things beforehand, or do you want to, have them try and do a sparse coverage of the entire country? And then you need the data analysis, right? You're going to have so much data, so many false positives or false triggering, that you need a way of sorting through enormous amounts of data and figuring out what you're going to throw out and what you're going to keep. And all of these things we're used to doing in other scientific enterprises. And without that, if we don't do that, we're going to be having the same damn argument about these things for, the next 100 years.
But if I give you $1 trillion and asked you to allocate it to one place, looking out, SETI, or looking at Earth, which should you allocate to?
Oh God, looking out. Because that's the best, as I always like to say, here's my codification of this. If you said, hey, Adam, I'd like to find some Nebraskans. And I said, oh, good, let's go to the Himalayas. You'd be like, why am I going there? I'm like, well, maybe there's some Himalaya, some Nebraskas in Himalaya. You say, no, let's go to Nebraska. If we're looking for aliens, why don't we look on alien planets where they live? Because we have that technology now, as opposed to the bucket of assumptions that you have to come up with in order to say, like, oh, they're here right now. They just happen to be here right now. And also, the very important thing, I called this the high beam argument. To deal with the UFO stuff, you have to deal with you have to answer these weird, irrational things that are happening. Like, okay, there's an advanced civilization that is visiting Earth regularly. They don't want to be detected. They've got super powerful technology, but they really suck at using it because we keep seeing them. But then they disappear, right? I mean, explain to me what rational world that works under. It's like, so there's that whole sort of argument you've got to explain, like, why, if they want to stay hidden, are they so bad at it? So, that's why I take that level of difficulty and then I put it on top of, where should I look? I should look at I should look at where they're from. That makes me want to do the telescopic stuff.
Yeah, I think the more likely explanation is either the sensors are not working correctly or it's secret military technology being tested.
Absolutely. I mean, if you had to listen, that's why, again, I think UAP, absolutely UAPs should be studied scientifically. But if I had to make a bet, and it's just a bet, I would say this is pure state adversary stuff. When I did a New York Times op-ed for this in 2021, which blew up, and so I had a lot of people talking to me. While I was doing that, I sort of looked at the signals intelligence people, the SIGINT and EINT, electronic intelligence communities, and what they were saying about the New York Times articles and the various videos. And really, none of them were talking about UFOs. They were all talking about pure state. That's where I learned the word pure state adversaries. How, like, even simple drone technologies, you can, and you purposely want to do this. You want to fake, signals into the electronics of their adversary, so they crank it up. Mm-hmm. So then you can just soak up all the electromagnetic radiation and know exactly what those advanced radars can do.
That said, I'm not saying that that's what this is. If I was the head of an alien civilization and I chose to minimize the amount of contact I'm doing,
mm-hmm.
I would try to figure out what would these aliens like to see.
Yeah.
That's why, like, the big heads in the humanoid form.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, that's kind of like how I would approach communication. If I was much more intelligent, I would observe them enough. It's like, all right, if I wanted to communicate with an ant colony,
right,
I would observe it long enough to see what are the basic elements of communication.
Yeah.
And maybe I would do a trivial thing, like do a fake ant.
Right, a robot ant.
Robot ant. But then it's not enough to just do a robot ant. You have to do a robot ant that, like, moves in the way they do.
Yeah.
And maybe aliens are just shitty at doing the robot ants. But no, I just wanted to make the case for that.
This is the plot, actually, of a great science fiction book called Eon by Greg Bear. And the idea was, like, these sort of, this is actually where my first, I became sort of more than agnostic, anti-medi. Because the idea is that, yes, our aliens come, they sort of make their arrival. And really their point is to get rid of us. It's the dark forest hypothesis. And what they do is they sort of literally, the way they present themselves is in this sort of classic UFO thing. And they do it, and they arrive at this was during the Soviet Union, they arrive at the USSR, they arrive in China, and they're kind of faking us out so that we never can organize ourselves against. So it was really, they did exactly kind of what you're talking about, but for nefarious purposes.
Okay. Let me ask the pothead question. Yet another
The
I'm
whole
sorry.
conversation is
I'm sorry.
bongs before breakfast.
It's science and pothead questions back and forth. Okay. What if aliens take a form that's unlike what we kind of traditionally envision in analyzing physical objects? What if they take the form of, say, ideas? What if real pothead, if it's consciousness itself, like the subjective experience, is an alien being? Maybe ideas then is an easier one to visualize because we can think of ideas as entities traveling from human to human.
When I made the claim that the most important, that finding life, any kind of life, would be the most important discovery in human history. And one of the reasons is, again, as I said, that life, if we're not an accident and there's other life, then there's probably lots of other life. And because the most significant thing about life is it can innovate, right? If I give you a star and tell you the mass and the composition, you can basically pretty much using the laws of physics tell exactly what's going to happen to that star over its entire lifetime. Maybe not the little tiny details, but overall, it's going to be a white dwarf, it's going to be a black hole, end of story. If I gave you a single cell and said what's going to happen in a few billion years, you'd never be able to predict a giant rabbit that can punch you in the face, right?
Yeah.
A kangaroo. So life has this possibility of innovating, of being creative. So what it means is, and that's a part of a kind of a fundamental definition of what it means to be alive. It goes past itself. So give life enough time, and what are the end result? There's that's why I love science fiction so much. At some point, does life reach a point where it climbs into the laws of physics itself? It becomes the laws of physics, or these sort of lie at the extreme limits of thinking about what we mean by reality, what we mean by experience. But I'm not sure there was much we can do with them scientifically. But they're open-ended question about the open-ended nature of what it means to be alive and what life can do.